critically gives you the means to sharpen your understanding and make sense of the world. That's why we've been talking about all of these tools like perception, belief, problem solving, analysis, and all of those tools are the things that you use to think critically and take information in. Chapter 8 talks about how to make those pieces fit together. How do we get all of these pieces of information, all of these things that we perceive, believe, or decide to relate to one another? There are three basic patterns of relating and organizing information. The first type is chronological or process relationships. The second is comparative or analogical. And the third kind is causal relationships. In this video, we'll take a look at all three. One of the most common ways to relate ideas is through story. In your text, it's called narrative. Narrative might be conveyed in the written format through a blog or a diary. It could also be conveyed in conversation, stories amongst people, conveying information or relating ideas one to the next. Narrative can also be on a grander scale. Consider the narrative of what it means to be an American. One of the stories Americans tell ourselves is about Western expansion and how we conquered the Wild Wild West. Well, just think how that story might relate back to the concept of what it means to be an American, where the concept of being an American means not taking no for an answer or not being afraid to try. Stories make up our identity and our concept of our identity. So here's a little assignment. I want you to press pause on the video and I want you to think of a narrative from your own family. Maybe it's a story about your grandma who lived during the days of segregation. Maybe it's a story about your parents who perhaps were the first people in your family to go to college. And think about their story and how their story relates to your concept of self. How that narrative relating one idea to the next influenced your own narrative, your own self-narrative. Another type of time-ordered relationship is process. And process has to do with aspects of growth or development towards an ultimate idea or event. Using communication, we organize one idea to the next in a step or time-ordered process. Here's an example. Have you ever heard the phrase, you have to crawl before you walk or walk before you run? Well, that's an example of how we use language and process relationships in order to convey ideas. The second type of relationship is the comparative or analogical relationship. These kinds of relationships focus on similarities and differences amongst ideas, things, or events. In a comparative relationship, you compare things in the same general category aimed at helping you make a choice. On page 331 in your text, the book uses jeans as a form of comparison, using the standards of price, fit, brand, quality. Just think how often you do this throughout your day. If you go grocery shopping, you do this numerous times before you even reach the checkout aisle. You might compare taste, brand, price, serving size, amount, calories, all when selecting just one out of many items you might put in your cart. No doubt before you made the choice to come to Tidewater Community College, you did a comparative analysis. You compared location of school, class times, class topic offerings, and price, of course. Now, the thing about comparative relationships is that not all aspects of comparison are the same. And these are called your standards of comparison. You use criteria or standards of comparison to make your choice. And what you find is that not everything is equal. So there may have been one school, for example, Old Dominion University or Norfolk State University, that was everything else you wanted. It was the location, it was the classes, it was the school spirit. But perhaps the cost made it prohibitive to attend. And so cost might have outweighed your decision, bringing you here to TCC, meaning that the standards of comparison, where the cost outweighed all of the rest. Now, there's no right or wrong answer. Your standards of comparison are that. They're just yours. Yours are going to vary or be different from other people's standards of comparison, and how much weight you give to each will vary as well. Again, there's no right or wrong, But the danger in standards of comparison comes when we either choose too few aspects to compare, or we heavily weight our aspects of comparison towards one side, where we know, in essence, the outcome is predetermined. Analogical relationships, or analogies, are basically the comparison of two things that are dissimilar. Analogies are really helpful because as we compare two things that are different, it sometimes helps us to increase our understanding about both things. And what you'll find is that you use analogy throughout your conversation because they're so helpful in explaining what we are trying to get what we're trying to say or how we're trying to get our point across. Now, there are two kinds of analogies. The first is a simile. In a simile, the comparison that you're making between these two dissimilar things is explicit. And that's because through the use of language, we identify to the listener that we are making a comparison. And we do that by using the words like or as. So an example of a simile, like or as, is what you're looking for. Life is like a box of chocolates. That's a simile. Metaphors, on the other hand, are comparisons between dissimilar things where the comparison is implied. What we're doing is relying on the listener to understand that we're not being literal, but that we're comparing things in a way to convey or offer an example of what we're trying to mean. If I say, life is a box of chocolates, I hope nobody gets confused and starts eating the things around them, or thinks that they could start, like Willy Wonka, going through the chocolate factory and eating things. Life isn't necessarily a box of chocolates literally, but it's like one because you don't necessarily know what you're going to get. So here's a quick challenge. I want you to pause the video and I want you to think of 3 examples of similes and 3 examples of metaphors that are not in your book, ones that you might use in order to convey meaning. Finally, there are causal relationships, which takes a look at the way events influence one another. A causal chain is an example of a relationship where one thing leads to another thing, which leads to another thing, and to another thing. Now, a causal relationship is the type of thing we experience frequently throughout the day, especially when we're having a bad day. One thing leads to the next, which leads to the next. Ultimately, we get to work late. And when people say, let's get to the root of the problem, oftentimes that's the phrase that they use to identify that there is a causal chain here, and we need to find out what the originating point is. The trouble is that finding the root of the problem is often a matter of perspective. For example, if my car broke down, I might say that the root cause was because it's old. It's a 2001, and so that led to one thing leading to the next, and finally it breaks down. But my husband might say my car broke down because I didn't perform the proper maintenance on it, which led to failures of the engine or problems with the brakes, which ultimately led to me not being able to drive. And if you think about it, all of you are experts in causal chains. Look back at your action maze. Not only did you use your lessons about belief, perception, and problem solving, you basically created a series of causal chains which indicate one event leads to another, which leads to another. Ultimately, the participant in the action maze passes or fails as a result of the decisions or the causes which preceded it. Contributory causes are a little bit different. Where causal chains are one thing leading to another, contributory causes is when one thing and another thing and a third thing all happen at the same time and all ultimately lead to an end result or end effect. So if you've ever used the phrase, everything happened at once, it all hit me at the same time, that is a phrase which expresses the experience of contributory causes. Maybe you were feeling sick or unwell. Maybe you had been putting off maintenance on your car for a while. Maybe you had a full plate, in terms of your studies. And then ultimately, all of those things led to perhaps having low patience and getting into an argument with your boyfriend or your girlfriend. Finally, interactive causes are the kind of causes that are reciprocal. They influence one another. In essence, they go back and forth to both cause one thing and affect another. Think of social relationships and how important it is in those kinds of scenarios. Here's an example of an argument. Imagine for a second you work as a customer service representative. You are hungry, you are tired, and your shift is about to be over. The store is going to close in 10 minutes. And in walks a customer. Now they take their time in making their selection and finally come up to the counter, only to find out that the item that they selected, they thought was on sale, actually isn't on sale. Now they get a little bit loud, and you think that they are being loud and rude for absolutely no reason, so then you get a little loud too. And the customer maybe gets offended by this, storms out of the store, and tomorrow he or she calls your manager to make a complaint about you. Now your manager calls you into the office and says, "I've had too many calls like this about you. I'm sorry, you're fired." This is an example of interactive causes. It's not one thing leading to another, leading to another. There's a whole backstory there. It's not contributory causes because everything didn't happen all at once. Rather, it's interactive because we can see where one thing influenced another and then caused and then influenced again. So for example, your perception of that customer getting a little rude obviously influenced your decision to maybe get a little loud with them, which obviously influenced their decision to storm out and make a complaint. Now at any one of those decision points, a different decision could have been made. However, when we are kind of going with the flow of interactive causes, it's easy to get swept up in ultimately sometimes what are not the best situations. So Chapter 8 takes a look at the different ways we relate all this information, one piece of information to the next, creating a big picture. There were chronological and process relationships, comparative and analogical relationships, and causal relationships. If I were a student in this class, I would definitely know all the kinds of relationships. I would have examples for each kind of relationship, and I would be able to represent these relationships in a graphic format, kind of like how the text does when they introduce each concept. So start putting this information together right away, recognizing how you relate information one to the next in your daily life. Good luck.